I will actually invite our first guest, Madam Ambassador Baiba Brage, the Assistant Secretary General at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to join me for the opening fireside chat, if you can take the seat there. Diplomacy, communications, women and peace, strengthening security and resilience in turbulent times. Madam Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So I very much remember our last meeting, albeit online, sadly, not in person. Our last meeting in person was back in London, I think, when Madam Ambassador was still the Latvian ambassador to the United Kingdom. But last time, we joined a session together with the Vice President of the European Commission, Maros Šefčovič, and we were discussing resilience, and we were discussing foresight, and this was May 2020. So literally a few months into the pandemic, the official pandemic, and we were talking about how well we have managed to deal with the pandemic at the time. But this was, if we think about it, if we look back, this was just the beginning of the pandemic. So my first question to you would be to look at the last 2 years since May 2020 and tell us how you feel we have, well, have we passed the exam, or there is still a lot to be done?
I'm always an optimist, so yes, we have passed the exam, and the fact that we are able to be here together in person, and I thank you for organizing this and the whole Emerging Europe team for being able to do it. Shows that we are both resilient, able to achieve things, but also able really to understand what is important and what it is not. So the fact that we have NGOs like yours, that we have private sector together with you, the fact that we have governments, international organizations being in the same place at the same time and speaking and thinking about the same subjects is what resilience is. It embodies a whole society's resilience. It means that it's not just the government's, whole of government making sure that societies, countries are able to recover or prevent crises and shocks, but there is whole society approach with private sector involved, with non-governmental sectors, with various social organizations, media, academia, and so on and so forth. And that is to achieve concrete objectives, whether to achieve preparedness for a shock or crisis, and for that we need clearly situational awareness, where all the countries at NATO work together. We need sharing of the best practices from the private sector into the public sector, the work of media, the work of open source analysts. We need, of course, the readiness for our telecommunications sectors to be understanding and prepared to provide services during the crisis and after. So there's a whole set of so-called baseline objectives that we at NATO have identified and towards what we work with the allies. So resilience is a national prerogative, but it's also a collective responsibility, because without it, whether at NATO or the EU or any other ways we are organized, we won't be able to achieve our objectives as the alliance.
And if you look at the lessons that we have learned, because obviously there have been excellent examples of resilience, but there were challenges as well. So what lessons do you think we have learned over the last two years?
I think the biggest lesson actually is being learned now in the last 3 months, and actually longer. When we look back at the time when Russia started raising numbers of its troops already last spring at the Ukrainian borders, it was very clear to see that it was a whole society, the whole alliance effort actually to identify what was going on. We relied on open source analysts, we relied on the sources on the ground, reporting. We relied, of course, on our intelligence services, being able to analyze and pull the information analysis together. But we also decided to publish all that information and analysis publicly. And that really created the sort of basis for that common understanding of the threat and the preparedness to answer it. We, of course, shared a lot with our Ukrainian partners, and I think we can all just deeply admire the way Ukraine prepared for this attack, the readiness that it had, the ability to pull in the private sector, the civil society. It's the embodiment of resilience, not only the ability to fight that sacred war of resistance and liberation of Ukraine, but to have that will to fight and have the whole of society behind this aim.
I wanted to go back to also the pandemic. We're going to continue the topic of the war in a second, but when we look at the pandemic, do you see any specific lessons that we have learned from that?
Again, I can't speak for all the countries. I can speak for NATO, what we did. I think all the crisis preparedness exercises that we did, there were various scenarios, and there were lessons learned from those exercises, and very practical exercises. They actually helped to make sure that we as NATO, as alliance, never stopped continuing. We never went online as a defense alliance. We continued our business, so business continuity that stems from lessons learned from these crisis management exercises is essential. That's the first lesson learned. Second, investment in modernization of technology and the most modern ability both to communicate but also to gather information, safety and security is essential. So we had been starting that before the pandemic. And again, part of that was lessons learned from the exercises, but part was just the necessity to answer the modern day challenge of digitalization. So that really enabled the whole ability of the alliance to continue to function, but also to use the most modern means of communication to get to the audiences globally. Because again, it's not only 1 billion NATO citizens, but the other billions of the Earth citizens who will mostly know NATO as a digital NATO. Mm-hmm. They will come in possibly little contact with our forces on the ground or with our operations or with our people. So that investment, conscious investment in the most modern capabilities was essential. So that's number two, which enabled also us to really pass the pandemic without it. And third, really various lines of defenses within operations, within headquarters, within meetings, essentially making sure, that the operating procedures are observed, whether that's with regard to the doctor's recommendations, the mask wearing, a very strict adherence to the rules, which again decreased the risks to the minimum and made sure that our mission to continue to protect 1 billion of NATO's citizens is viable and we can fulfill that.
One of the topics in that discussion that we had back in 2020 was also, disinformation and propaganda, and we have obviously seen an enormous increase in that over the last few months. How do you? What are your thoughts on disinformation and propaganda happening right now?
I didn't touch that subject, but that's also during the pandemic. We saw different countries doing having different approaches and doing different things. But clearly what we noticed was the most powerful engagements and following came from the experts, knowledgeable experts in the field that people felt they could rely on, that there was a huge need for reliable, trustful information that people were seeking, different groups. So actually having those experts that are able to communicate and get their messages out in the public to enable people to get the information, to rely on it, and then follow the recommendations. In some countries it worked better, in some others not as good, and you could see also the difference in how societies reacted. Having said that, on the disinformation and propaganda, I think it's important to define and understand what we are talking about. Mm-hmm. At NATO, we define hostile information activities, which are activities that can be by state or state-enabled actors or others that have the intent to undermine certain activities by other states and achieve particular objectives, whether that is splitting certain societal groups, undermining credibility of political or military operations. It can be different. But essentially there is a hostile actor,
Yes.
can be state-enabled actor, and there is intent to achieve certain objectives. And in case of Russia, of course, these hostile campaigns are part of the political military objectives. So it's not just done, like that for nothing, but it's part of the overall political military approach. Then we have disinformation, which we regard as malicious or untruthful information that can be spread by various actors, but there is not necessarily that hostile intent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? So it can be, again, done by sheer purpose to be important or gain attention or a variety of other reasons, but it's not the purpose of undermining certain countries' social texture or other hostile intents. And then there's misinformation, of course, which is, again, can be manifestly untruthful, but there's just no
unintentional, perhaps.
No intention, nothing else, and very often people don't even realize that they are spreading misinformation, all right? So I think that is important to understand. In all three cases, it's not a new phenomenon for the humankind. That has existed as long as humans exist, and for the alliance, that has always been the case. When we look 73 years ago, when NATO was established, throughout the years, the active measures, variety of disinformation, misinformation, propaganda against NATO has been run. And that is true today. What we saw from the first day of Russia's war against Ukraine, of course, was phenomenal societal mobilization. Mobilization of all the NGOs, private sector, open source intellectuals, open source analysts, intellectual groups, cultural groups. Everybody was behind Ukraine. We also saw that at the political level at the United Nations, where more than 140 countries defined Russia's aggression against Ukraine as a violation of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. So it was a huge mobilization. So obviously it had an effect also on the people in our countries and around the world. Gradually, again, it's a reality, with the war fatigue setting in, with the changing nature of the war becoming the war of attrition in particular parts of Ukraine. There are different elements of, again, hostile activities, of disinformation, misinformation that are coming in. Also, because of the actions of the governments closing down Russian state hostile actor channels, sources, quite a number of them have moved to closed communication channels, so they are coordinating on closed communication channels, be it Telegram or others, which are more difficult to perceive, but that action still continues. Their actions in our societies have also become different. They are using influencers in our countries to spread and question everything that the governments are doing. And it's much more difficult, I think, for societies and for the governments to maintain the same level of motivation and mobilization. However, let's remember that all of us have a role to play, because it's not only understanding that we are supporting not only Ukraine's right to self-defense, but we are supporting the world how we want it to be lived. That there are rules that are respected, that we rely that these rules provide for the security and prosperity for us in the future. And that if we commit as countries to respecting these rules, that we can rely that they will be observed. So in that respect, all of us, of course, have a very particular interest to continue supporting Ukraine with everything that we can. At individual level, with donations, Ukraine needs a lot of food, a lot of supply of fuel, a lot of medical help, everything that is possible, but also as governments. And here, I think the alliance has been very clear. We have political unity, because again, a Russian attack has undermined the security in not only in Europe, but across the Euro-Atlantic space. So political unity, military support that allies provide to Ukraine, and it's not only allies, 30 allies, there are a much wider group of countries that do that, and that is, again, to enable Ukraine's right to self-defend, which is UN Charter guaranteed rights. There is no higher international legal document than this. And in that respect, we just have to continue supporting both Ukraine's ability to defend and the will to do that.
When we look at NATO over the years, its mission, its tasks have developed. This morning we were talking about cybersecurity cyber attacks on Ukraine. The Minister of Digital Transformation mentioned several hundred such attacks, recently. What do you think is the role of NATO? How do you see NATO's mission develop going forward?
Where we are currently at NATO, next week we have the Madrid summit, which will be a defining summit also for the alliance. Not only because of the basic role, the crucial role for NATO strengthening our own deterrence and defense, and so there will be a long-term postural alignment, what the new strategic environment means for NATO, for our self-defense, and how do we ensure that our 1 billion people continue to be safe and protected. But also, how do we prepare for the future? So the big adaptation on emerging disruptive technologies. What does it mean, the big climate change? What does it mean for our security? What can we do about it as militaries with regard to the equipment and understanding the effects of the change of temperatures, the locations where we are operating, so on and so forth. It also means everything around the hybrid threats, including cyber. Not only how it affects us, but also what actors are out there, what they are doing, how do we share information, how do we draw the best practices, how do we work with the private sector, which often is the first one to respond to a number of issues, how do we establish that reliable, sort of resilient ability to work with the best people to defend in cyber sector. How do we ensure that we have resilient cyber networks that are defendable, not only as NATO, but also in the governments and elsewhere? So there is a whole spectrum of adaptation that is taking place. And that all will be embodied in the new strategic concept, which will provide the expression of collective will of 30 allies. How do we see strategic environment? So assessment, essentially what the world is like for us as the alliance. On what principles will we base the alliance for the future in our response, and what we will do about it. I can't speak much about it currently, it's negotiated, but quite clearly there will be new elements that we didn't see in the previous strategic concept of 2010, where Russia was characterized as a possible strategic partner. So that will surely be a different characteristic. There is not a word about China, so most likely allies will choose to have a certain wording on China, because we have seen China's military growth, China's cyber attacks against allies, the active hostile information campaigns that China is running against allies. So there will be a climate and security angle will be there, and of course the recognition that human security is an essential part of why Alliance has its mission to protect, but also on women, peace and security, and its essential role on preventing conflicts, on including women in all aspects of decision-making operations, and making sure that there is no any kind of misunderstanding about it.
I'm glad you mentioned the role of women in security, because
That's why I mentioned that.
the next session is actually about women, and I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about women in security, how NATO sees that.
Again, so for us, women, peace and security is not only about recognition that women are affected in conflicts, and we see that in Ukraine in a particular way. It's not only conflict-based sexual violence and women and children being particularly affected, but also women as actors of change, women as part of conflict resolution, getting them involved at the very beginning of all the decision-making and being part of the preparations. It's about training our military, of recognizing and addressing in the operations if they see certain events happening, and how to recognize and how to deal with that. It's about increasing number of women in our armed forces, because again, we need the best talents for the best forces that we have. Increasing the number of women also in the decision making in headquarters. So there is the whole spectrum of very practical work, actually, that we are doing.
And perhaps if we had more women in security or in governments, we wouldn't be in this situation right now, and I'm talking about the war. Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for supporting, for your words about the Summit and Awards program and Emerging Europe's activities.